For American soccer fans, today is a bigger day than perhaps most of them realize, as Bob Bradley has been named the new manager of Swansea City Football Club. Now, Bob Bradley is making history because he is the first manager to manage in the first division of a Big Five European soccer league. As the first American to do so, he is also the first American to have managed in the top flight anywhere in Europe, as he had done so in Norway. We are talking about a manager who has been a true journeyman, so much experience, and has really earned this opportunity. He has been through the managerial wilderness, as many would call it. After getting fired by the U.S. national team, he took over as the head coach of the Egyptian national football team, and he really led that system through some incredibly difficult times. He managed them through what was essentially a civil war. When Egypt could not play domestic games in their country, Bradley traveled all over Africa, wherever he could, to get game time. It was an incredibly difficult time for the national side, but you could certainly argue that it made them stronger and created positive results. Bradley's tenure ended in heartbreak as he led Egypt to the World Cup qualifying playoffs, where they ultimately lost in the final round to Ghana. However, I think it would be fair to say that the Egyptian national team was better off because of the time that Bob Bradley spent there. After a brief spell in Norway, Bradley signed a 2-year contract at French League Two side Le Havre. And at Le Havre last season, of course, it was an underreported story because it didn't happen, but Bradley was so painfully close to getting that team promoted. Would have been a massive accomplishment for him in his managerial career, but ultimately it wasn't meant to be, because apparently it was meant to be that he takes over at a Premiership club, perhaps maybe even a little bit sooner than he might have expected, but he has managed all over the world. And it's easy to forget the successes he had as the U.S. national team manager. You know, he took the men's national team out of the group stage at the World Cup, which is always a difficult thing to do. And you could argue that the U.S. national team's most successful tournament outside of CONCACAF was at the 2009 Confederations Cup, where the U.S. beat Spain. Okay, they beat the Spanish national team, the ultimate World Cup winners the following year, and they were so incredibly close to taking down Brazil in the final for the U.S. men's national team's first ever major tournament trophy, if you want to count the Confederations Cup as one. I would in that instance. But at any rate, you know, you could argue that he had gotten stale, that they were tired of him, whatever. Bradley's time as the U.S. men's national team coach deserves to be remembered as a success, even if it didn't end the way he had hoped for after that defeat to Mexico. So, really, you know, Bob Bradley is a coach who is a true student of the game. He is an incredibly hard worker. He is a humble man, has never been about himself. And, you know, he's always tried to learn from the European sides. He has studied FC Barcelona and Juventus in particular very closely. I read of how Bob Bradley, you know, in the early 90s when he was managing the Princeton men's soccer team before he even made the jump to MLS, you know, he tried to build that team much like those dominant AC Milan sides of the early 90s. So, you know, he knows European football better than probably many people give him credit for. Yes, the Swansea job is going to be incredibly difficult. They only have one win in the Premier League so far. They do not have momentum. Fortunately, Bradley has an international break to kind of acclimate himself at the club and get settled in. So that is very, very important for him. But, you know, if the Premier League was played on paper, if we're just looking at sheer talent on rosters, Swansea City would perhaps be getting relegated. I'm not a huge fan of how talented this team is. I really like Leroy Fair. Gylfi Sigurdsson is capable of doing great things with his feet, both in open play and off of set pieces. However, I do think that Bob Bradley is going to face an uphill battle to keep this team safe and away from relegation. However, Bob Bradley's never been a man to back away from a challenge, so while my gut tells me that Swansea is ultimately going to get relegated, I certainly hope it does not happen because when you talk about an American soccer manager coming to England, especially, there's a stigma attached. People saying, oh, he can't do the job. He can't get it done. He's a bloody Yank. No, it's not like that because Bob Bradley has paid his dues. He knows the game well. And, he is destined to be successful. So, even if it doesn't ultimately work out for Bob Bradley, you would hope he gets a chance elsewhere. But this could be the defining moment in his managerial career. And unfortunately, although this might be a cynical way of looking at it, it's probably the case. Whether or not the next great American manager gets a chance to manage at one of the big five clubs or big five leagues in Europe, it could ultimately hinge on how Bob Bradley performs. He has the chance to kind of eliminate or at least chip away at the certain stigma that comes with American football. I've said the word soccer a lot. People watching this are probably resenting me for saying that. And I read this really funny tweet just to wrap things up here where, this is just a fake conversation. Someone says to Bob Bradley, people are really going to hate you when you say soccer. And then Bob Bradley says back, don't be an asshole. And then he says, well, actually here, it's not asshole, it's arsehole. So I got a kick out of that one. Like I said, I will be very interested in seeing how this plays out for Bob Bradley, as every U.S. soccer fan should be.